Hi. So, for August of 2019, I chose to focus on the theme of the cultural significance of rural identity to the upcoming generations. And the topic, within that topic, I chose to focus on how rural Estonians and urban Estonians perceive the rural identity and why it is important to them, whether they practice it or believe it. So we'll kind of get it a little bit more into that later into the video. Identity. What is it? And what does it mean? Why is it important? Well, identity is kind of the critical component to contextualizing who we are, right? It's intrinsic to the human nature because it helps us understand ourselves for ourselves, also ourselves in our communities, as well as in our culture, in our countries, in our world, in the global context. So identity is very, very important and is expressed and it's expressed in a lot of ways. So a lot of scholars and researchers have spent decades and decades of time to observing this phenomenon. So identity is consensually agreed that it's usually influenced by external factors. So external factors, what are we talking about? We're talking about clothes. The clothes that we wear says a lot about who we are as people. So it can represent, the type of person you are, right? Some people who like to wear dresses more often might be understood to be more of this type of person, to a person who wears a lot of high fashion like Prada and Gucci will be understood to be this type of person, right? So this plays into our identity. We'll get a little bit into our identity and how others perceive our identity. Clothes also says a lot about, our socioeconomic standing in a society. Also, not just the clothes that we wear today of blue jeans and dresses and Prada and Gucci and whatever. We're also talking about folk costumes, because some cultures still wear these folk costumes to this day. Some preserve it for, special momentous events such as weddings, birthdays, life event markers in life. And some choose to not participate in wearing that. They don't feel an inclination to wearing the folk costume of their culture, and prefer to be, modern and try to leave that aspect in, a more past box, if that makes sense. So, clothes is such a great way for people to play with their identity and, express their identity. But not only clothes do we understand our identity, but also food. So food is really important, what we eat, what we say, the saying, I don't know, you might not know the saying, but there's a saying of you are what you eat, right? So that's quite interesting. Like, what does the food I eat say about me? For example, let's talk about vegetarian. If this is a very select chosen diet, vegetarianism, it says a lot about how maybe we see ourselves, our identities within a political statement, economic statement, cultural statement, religious statement. So food really can operate as a vehicle in a way to express who we are. Maybe somebody eats a lot of chocolate and considers themselves to be very sweet. But not only that, I want to also touch on the external factor of environment, and where we are and where we grow up and where we live plays a lot into the identity that we have for ourselves, the community, and so forth. So, for example, I grew up in Hawaii. Very humid place, in my opinion, and the weatherman's opinion. But, you know, the warm weather kind of facilitates this and fosters more laid back behavior. Can't really be bothered to, overthink some things, maybe while a cold climate person might. Who knows? It differs. I'm not saying this is concrete like examples. This is my personal example. And so, I want to propose for you, the viewer, to think about how the environment of your childhood, the environment that you live in today, really influences how you see yourself. Because I think it does play an important role. And it made me think and reflect, how has growing up in Hawaii, facilitated in shaping my identity? How has the environment of Estonia helped shape my identity as well? And it's something that we have to think about. And the environment, the landscape itself, so often gets forgotten and left behind when we think about identity. And that's kind of what this article, Young People's Narratives of Rural-Urban Differences by Robert Vanderbeck and Cheryl Dunkley, kind of, draw from and kind of contextualize. So let's get into that. Article, Young People's Narratives of Rural-Urban Differences, Robert Vanderbeck and Cheryl Morris Dunkley capitalize on utilizing the narrative identity in a way to navigate and construct how young people perceive the rural identity and their urban identity. Their research, their case study, is situated in the United States of America in 2 different states, and they drew from 2 groups, the rural and the urban, of the ages between 14, I believe was the youngest, to about 19, so the formative teenage years. And they wanted their case study to be able to be applicable to, a wider audience, not just for Americans in the United States, of, the young people. They wanted it to be more inclusive of maybe others' experiences around the world. So I drew from their study and contextualized it within the Estonian locality and test it in such a way. So before we get into that aspect, I kind of want to contextualize their article so that you and I share an understanding of what's happening. So they drew from both groups, both controlled groups of the urbanites and the rural, and asked them to explain how they understand and perceive each of the spaces. Not even the identities, just the landscape itself, right? The environment. So a lot of the answers that came up for rural environments, spaces, landscapes, was that it was beautiful, a lot more nature, forests, rivers, more earthly smells associated with like rotting wood, fallen trees, the smell of rain and leaves, grass, animal smells, manure, more farm stimulated perceptions. And then on the opposite spectrum, when asked to explain the urban spaces, a lot of the answers came out to be huge buildings, tall buildings that touch the sky, right? And more of a man-made environment. So we're talking about the skyscrapers that were just previously mentioned, to cars, to trains, to other assortment of buildings, concrete sidewalks. And a lot of people understood the urban spaces to be more cultured. There was a lot more of these attractions, cultural attractions such as museums, art galleries. There's a lot more selection of international food, for example, shopping malls. So the hub of civilization was hyper-focused into the urban center and not so much in the rural, right? But with the positive must come the negatives, because you cannot have one thing without the other, right? So, what were some of the more negative perceptions of these spaces? And for the rural aspect, it was boring because it lacked the intellectual stimulation. It lacked visual stimulation, audio stimulation, all the sounds and chaos of cityscapes. Um, and what about the urban centers? Like, what were some negatives? And the negatives that came out of that was it was congested. Congested. It was too much people. Pollution because all the exhaust of the cities. Um, Also pollution of sound, noises. There was too much noise happening, and it was overbearing for people who were not accustomed to these spaces. So, um, you know, both spaces have their own pros and cons. And with that, with a previous statement made, where the environment does influence our identities, we draw on this into contextualizing, what is the urban identity and what is the rural identity, right? Really fascinating, actually. So the urbanite, because they come from the space that is understood to be a lot more cultured, more refined, and you know, cosmopolitan. These cityscapes and you know, access to a lot of other things outside of the world. Um, so that transcended into the urban identity through a ways of which the urbanite was understood to be cultured but snobbish, kind of like stuck up, uppity, like, oh, I'm better than you kind of behavior. Whether or not that was true, it depends on each individual themselves. But that was kind of like a general idea of, oh, what's a person from the city like? They're like this, right? But for the rural, we also get the same, not the same answer, but kind of the same concept of like, because it's wide open spaces, nature, it's quiet, it doesn't have man made noise as much. So people of the countryside were understood to be more quaint, like lovely people, but also conservative because they weren't exposed to more progressive things, different things of outside of their culture, their country, and so forth. Um, they were also perceived to be lazy, undereducated, and the likes. Um, so, like I stated, this case study was conducted in the United States, but Vanderbeek and Dunkley really wanted it to be applicable to communities outside of that. And so I kind of like drew that into my studies, or kind of like my little simulated research. And uh, it came out to be very interesting because I found a lot of similarities, honestly. And so I want to explain that through giving you a little bit more of a historical background to Estonia, because that is very incredibly vital to helping you folks understand how Vanderbeek and Dunkley's article is reflected within Estonia and the rural identity and understanding and importance of to the upcoming generations. So Ans Vides wrote a book titled The Old Estonian Folklife, published in 2004, and he paints an idyllic image of what Estonia's landscape looks like, from the beautiful, forests, a land of long winters and short summers, um, as well as the maritime weather near the Baltic Sea. And so it's very interesting how, to contextualize the rest of his book, he starts off by explaining the environment. You know, he explains how through the environment grew two general groups of Estonians back then, those of the forest and those of the sea. And the livelihood of um, ancient Estonians largely depended on fishing, hunting, a lot of this like hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle. Mushrooms, berries, plants were very important, fish, and so forth. Um, but he says, but this was a very distant past, at least during the past 2 millennia, the Estonians have been farmers, a lot of peasantry, and agriculture boomed um, throughout the last 2 millennia up to present time until the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's not to say, I'm not trying to proclaim that Estonian identity is very important, because it is one of the few select special ones of agricultural lifestyle. I'm not trying to proclaim that other cultures did not have a very strong agriculture standpoint. What I am trying to consecrate is that the agriculture aspect, the hunter-gatherer from the forest aspect, is very important for Estonians in particular. There is a archaic word called pronounced Maaravas, and that translates to people of the land. So that's very interesting. Before Estonians were calling themselves Estonians, they were calling themselves Maaravas, people of the land. And to further aid in understanding this, I drew from Ivar Paulson's book, The Old Estonian Folk Religion. And so he states that Estonians may no longer substantiate a majority of their livelihoods from the forest and sea in present day, but quote unquote, the images and customs originating from the old fisherman hunter environment, from the forest and its animals, from the water and its fish, have left such deep imprints in Estonian folk tradition that they have reappeared in more recent times. So he spends this entire chapter kind of contextualizing the most vital aspects and roles that the forest plays for Estonian folk identity. And during the times of peasantry, the forest was a place in which food could be found, material goods for building a house, or, adding to the home and so forth was found in the forest. But a lot of the forest also aided in creating a spiritual and almost mystical sense, religious relationship. And Paulson, I quote him to be, Estonians associate themselves one way or another with the forest and its creatures. His associations with animals and birds, or with the secret supernatural forces, powers, and beings such as forest spirits that govern the forest, were both on the physical and spiritual level. And so a lot of Estonian folklore also derives from the forest. There's a lot of tales of the spirits of the forest, those that were benign, those that, meant ill, and so forth, and how to communicate with them, interact with them, offer, offerings to appease them, sacrifices, and the such. So the folk culture of Estonia has been incredibly deeply imprinted by the natural landscape, the forest and sea, the natural environment, the world that they lived in the cultivation of their identity, that has persisted to today. So another book that I like to draw on is a fictional book written by Andrus Kiviraks, and it's titled The Man Who Spoke Snakish. And it's a wonderful tale about the last of the Estonian forest dwellers before the Iron Men, which were the Germans, the Baltic Germans that came into Estonia to civilize them, draw them out of the forest and give them a society in which they would toil the earth and, make bread and eat porridge and, be more human in a sense. And it's quite an interesting fictional tale because it talks of how the Estonians were the people of the forest, in which they could speak Snakish, the language of snakes. And it's quite fascinating because they lived such um, more savage lives in comparison to the Iron Men that came to the area, but they lived a lot more in tune, in harmony with the forest that they live and ate and grew up in and died in. You know, they knew how to talk to animals, they knew how to appease the forest spirits, they knew how to move about in the forest, to use this forest to cooperate with the forest, versus these Iron Men found themselves to be really confused and muddled when they were in the forest. They didn't know which way was in, which way was out, how to survive. You know, so it's very interesting that Kivirak would draw on this concept of, you know, the forest being of a home, a mother, a giver, and a taker for the Estonian identity. So, you know, we are now trying to understand what this forest identity and cultural heritage spaces, such as the rural environments, kind of come into play of the rural identity and its importance. And for this portion, I want to draw on Dogstead, Ronigan, and Skar's article. Apologies for mispronouncing these Norwegian names. Agriculture as an upholder of cultural heritage, conceptualizations, and value judgments, a Norwegian perspective in international context. And some important quotes that they offered is that cultural heritage is seen as a source of local added value, trade, and agriculture development, particularly when based on knowledge of tradition. You know, and so they're talking about how we cannot divorce ourselves from the environment, from the rural, because the rural spaces, the rural identity, and the people who reside in these spaces perform such vital roles in our society and how we understand our identities and who we are as people, because they are those who share and maintain the knowledge shared between man and nature, from the community member to the next, from one generation to the next. And so in this article, the three authors capitalize on the fact that these simplistic landscapes are cultural landscapes of vital essence of the human nature. You know, it's not just Norwegian, it's not just Estonian, it's both of our spaces, everybody's space. You know, this is the world that we live in. And so these cultural landscapes should and are protected by different NGO and governmental sectors, as well as other rural inhabitants, and the threat of disappearance, particularly in the face of uniformity frequently brought on by globalization. Without these rural spaces, it is, you know, important to understand that without them, we could not have these urban spaces that we've cultivated. We would not have food. We would not have as much culture, richness in culture, traditions. And these rural spaces and rural inhabitants are co-producers for with the urban spaces, and act as the caregivers and guardians for the sense of a past that would otherwise be lost to the deterioration of the rural population and landscape. So that's really important to consider, you know, when we talk about the urban within the rural and vice versa. So I wanted to understand the cultural significance of Estonian rural identity for the younger generation within Estonia by utilizing Van der Beek and Dunkley, the authors of the first article that was mentioned in this video. Wanted to draw on their case study findings and contextualize it within an Estonian context. And so I conducted 3 different interviews, 3 people who were willing to be interviewed about rural identity, and 2 of them are urban Estonians, between the ages of 19 and 26 years old. So the first one I interviewed, an urban Estonian, was Oscar. So I do want to make note that all the names of the interviews were changed for the protection of the interviewee, just for their, you know, sake of identity. So Oscar is 26 years old, and when I asked him, like, oh, you know, is the countryside important for Estonian identity? And he vehemently proclaimed, yes, it is, because, you know, it's so intrinsic to our nature and who we are. We like to interact with our nature a lot. We try to protect it as much as we can. We can. And he explained how the countryside is important because it's how they interact with the world, other people, themselves, and how nature, Estonian nature herself, helped facilitate the formulation of their identities. And he states that it holds such immense importance to Estonian identity, whether you're an urban person or a rural, because, quote unquote, without it, who would we be? Oscar himself also brought up Maravas, the term for people of the land. He also brought that up and kind of explained to me how Estonians were first Maravas, not cosmopolitan urbanites as they are today, and not all of them, some of them. But Oscar wanted to, accentuate the importance of the rural should not be forgotten, because Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, is a city. Tartu is a university city as well. These places wouldn't exist if it weren't for the people who started it all, and these people came from the rural. And so he wants to remember that there is a beginning for all urbanites, and that spans to the rural spaces. And he says, and there really isn't a lot of Estonians who want to stay in these rural areas. They all want to come to Tallinn or Tartu, but what about these places that are being left behind? We can't leave them empty. And so Oscar himself sees the importance and, asking himself, what does this mean for Estonia if we leave these spaces empty? What is that? It changes the identity as well. And so he brought up these concerning points for himself and for his fellow Estonians as well. Hannah, on the other end, she's a interviewee of 19 years old. And she is one that lives in an urban center, Tallinn specifically, yet she has frequented the countryside because her grandparents live there, and so she visits them often, mostly during the summers, spending weeks on end. So when I asked her about these questions, she also shared similar perspectives, that of Oscar's, but also how she doesn't always feel like these people are as educated as those that she associates herself or sees in Tallinn. She says their choice of words are different, and there are things they don't do or have interest in, like stuff that's happening outside of Estonia. When I had asked her what she found attractive about the countryside as an urbanite, she responded, I like it here because it's simple. It's quiet and I don't feel very stressed out when I am with them, her grandparents. But I suppose for younger people who live in the cities, the rural side of Estonia is more linked to grandparents and childhood and wholesome life. But then again, if you look at the other side of the coin, rural life symbolizes sometimes the second Estonia, or the underside, or the part of society which is stuck in its ways, ambitionless, plain stupid, and so forth. So it's quite interesting to see the two responses that I received from two urban people, where one recognized the importance and the vitality behind rural landscape and rural identity of Estonia. Meanwhile, the other tended to be more cosmopolitan and aware of the modern context of her identity and, the differences and what defines her as not being of the rural countryside and what defines her as an urban inhabitant. The interviewee does recognize the importance of the people that live in these spaces because it is part of her cultural heritage as an Estonian, but she says, But not me. I don't think I could or would want to live in the countryside forever. Therefore, reiterating what defines her as and what does not define her as an Estonian, uh, as an urban versus a rural Estonian. My third interviewee is Oliver. He is a 22-year-old and he lives in a rural space, specifically a farm in the countryside. And he shared some of his ideas of what it means to have the identity that he has and the identity that has been cultivated because he grew up and lives in the rural landscape. Um, he says, I think it's important because it's who we are. Sure, some people from Tallinn and other places don't get why anyone would want to live out here, but they can't deny that they don't participate somehow with a rural idea. And so when I asked for clarification in what do you mean by participating with the rural idea, the rural idyllic, he answered that there's this sense of expressing your Estonianness. And what he means by this is a lot of people use social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram to document moments in which they go out into the forest, whether that be hiking, picking berries, finding mushrooms, to uh, making pickles with their grandmothers, or spending time with their grandparents in the countryside. And he says that they don't live in these spaces and maybe don't understand the hardships that comes with these spaces, but they do recognize and participate in these activities as a way to express themselves to social media platforms. A lot of times, not always to an international platform, it might be just to other Estonians, but he says, if you think about it, if somebody from the city comes into the countryside, picks mushrooms, and posts it on their Instagram, their peer group is probably predominantly more urban than that of rural. So therefore, it's a way to, reconnect the urban people with this idea of what it means to be an Estonian, to go back to nature, to spend time in nature. And a lot of them, he says, he finds it quite funny, where they'll have hashtags, back to the land, hashtags Estonian, hashtag living for nature, hashtag nature is part of me, and all these other hashtags. Of course, they're all in Estonian, but he translated them as he showed these different photos as examples of some of his friends that went off to university in the capital city. So, through these interviews that I've conducted and contextualizing them within two nonfiction historical books of old folklore and old folk life of Estonians, as well as even a fictional book, I hope that I could express the cultural significance of rural identity for Estonians, both urban and rural, and why it should matter to the upcoming generations. Some questions that do remain, though, is how do the upcoming generations of both rural and urban inhabitants intend to preserve and protect the cultural heritage landscape and environment, as well as the rural identity? Because, as stated earlier, the rural identity is also a co-producer in the conceptualization of the Estonian identity. Nature plays intrinsic role in how Estonians perceive themselves. In a sense, there's a movement that is happening where the rural areas, while are facing mass depopulation in the face of globalization and monopolization, there are still those that are returning to the land and therefore their roots. However, the question remains of, is this enough? And what can be done for those that choose not to live in these rural spaces? What are the possibilities of, their cooperation to preserving this important identity, to connect them to their past, their history, and therefore their tomorrows and their future. That's all for this month, and thank you for your time and patience. And I look forward to sharing the next article and video come September. Thank you and have a wonderful day.